Well, everyone, welcome to another episode of Faithfully Engaged. I'm really happy to have Dr. Mark McNear here today. And before we get into this really good discussion, just wanted to have him introduce himself to the audience. So, Doctor Mark McNear, why don't you kind of tell the crowd about you a little bit?
I'd be glad to, Johnny. I am an author, I am a speaker, and my primary job is being a psychotherapist. I live in Northwest New Jersey.
Great, great. And I was talking to just off camera for a little bit. I was really trying my best to make this book, which is his book, Finding My Words. Trying to make it look nice and professional. And I did read it, and we're going to get into that discussion. I was going to take it off during the interview and look through parts, but it's not held together very well back there, so it's going to stay static. But I'll include a link to the book in the description and everything, and I'd highly suggest everyone to check it out because it is a great story. And kind of leading into that, let's start with not so much into the book, which we'll get there, but let's just talk a little bit about your being a psychotherapist and everything. What led you to get into that? Like, just tell a little bit of that story.
Sure. I was in Bible college, and I was originally going to be a pastor. And then I think it was the third year in Bible college, I was getting ready to be married. And so there was a lot of things that I felt like I needed to work on coming from the background that I came from. And so I had gone to a counselor, and I found how helpful that was. And so I really felt called after that to become a counselor. And so I finished up the pastoral track at the college and then spent longer there in psychology. I did a minor in psychology there, and then went on after that to NYU, and then to subsequent training after that.
Great. Yeah, I always enjoy when I talk with another clinician. Just hearing that story. I think we all have different paths, but those
Absolutely.
motivations behind why you get there,
Yeah.
they really help fuel your work for sure. Let's kind of get a little bit. I don't want to go too in depth into the book all at once, but since we do have it presented here and we really want to get into it, would you mind giving just a kind of a brief overview of what this book is about? Somebody that's just looking at it on screen
Sure. I'd be
there.
glad to.
What's it about?
Actually, actually, that's a picture of me when I was 5 years old.
Wow.
So that's a
Wow.
picture of me in kindergarten. So the book is about a journey that I started about 8 years ago. And I have been encouraged to write this story. And it was really hard story to write. But about 8 years ago, I found myself going into rehab for substance abuse. And then finding out just how much trauma I had in my childhood, and not having the words to be able to talk about a lot of the things that had happened to me. And so, little by little, in the counseling that I had and the encouragement that I had from my wife and my daughter and my son in law, I have been able to heal greatly from the trauma that I had. And, as I was progressing through, different counselors would comment to me, you really need to tell your story. And I was like, there's no way I'm telling my story. That began, actually, Johnny, that began in rehab where, therapists and other patients would say, tell me your story. And I was like, I didn't have the emotional wherewithal to be able to do it. And not only that, I didn't have the words to be able to do it. So the book talks about that journey. The beginning part is about being in rehab. The second part of the book is about complex trauma that I experienced in childhood, and then the last part of the book is really uplifting about the hope that I have in Jesus Christ, and just all of the things that the Lord has done in my life in the last 8 years.
Yeah, and that's something that went my process through reading the book. It it's really interesting that first part because I was telling my wife when I was reading it, it's kind of like when you're watching a movie and there's this big scene that happens and you're like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next? And then it takes you back to the past.
Yeah.
And that's really how this book is written. And I, I don't want to certainly you use too many words here because these are your words, but definitely that second part, and you even wrote about it. It's intense. It's very intense, and that's what I was saying off camera. That so many books and experiences, things like that on trauma, they seem to stop there. They just stop at the bad,
Hmm.
but this book doesn't. That there's
Yeah.
that hope at the end there. Um, I, that I was gonna ask this maybe a little bit further down, but as I was talking about that, this came to my mind. Where in that journey throughout this story, where did your faith in Christ really first pop up throughout your whole life story?
I one of the things I talk about in the book is the car accident that I had. And so I was about 19 years old. I got hit head on by a drunk driver and ended up in the hospital for about a month, a little bit over a month, and had a lot of injuries. And so after that, I started searching. And actually, I think that the Lord started searching me out and just putting people in my pathway and putting books and things like that. And I started reading a book by Norman Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking. And then, from there, as I read that book, it talked about getting a Bible and going to church. It talked about underlining passages in scripture. And I did that. And then I went to church, and I can remember it was a Saturday night that they had a special service, and they had a guy come in, and he spoke about going the second mile, and he gave an invitation to Jesus Christ at the end of it. And um, I wasn't totally aware of what I was doing, but I, went forward and then felt the call after that to go into Bible college shortly after that.
Yeah. Uh, that was something that really struck me with, um, I can't remember exactly where this was even written. In fact, I think it was written in multiple places, but that you spoke to how God was calling me. It wasn't, boy, I just woke up one day and I got it all figured out. It's
Right. But
I'm perfect. No,
I
he was
don't
searching
look
you.
back.
With on the on the addict side of things, I think especially after hearing, "Oh, well, I found Christ." Well, if you found Christ, then we don't have any more problems anymore, right? Like we don't deal with issues. So,
Clear,
what?
clearly not.
So, speak a little bit more into that of what that path of addiction looked like, and kind of what led you to get some help.
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to. I had gone when I was at New York University training. I had gone to a psychiatrist because I was really struggling a lot with anxiety and depression. And I was diagnosed at that time too, probably misdiagnosed with ADHD. But I was given medication, and the medication, immediately made me feel different. It made me feel calmer. It made me feel more relaxed. The problem with that was wonderful. But the problem with that is it didn't last. And so I would need to take more to get to the point of feeling that relaxed feeling in my body. And so I was really trying to outrun the trauma that I had experienced in my childhood, the complex trauma that I had experienced in my childhood. So, um, what had happened was that through the years, I just took more and more medication to be able to cope with the trauma that I carried inside of me. And I was still going to church, and I talk about that. And then I wasn't going to church for a while. Things really fell apart for me. But, that's the message that I wanted to bring forth in the book is sometimes when things fall apart, that's when the Lord is moving into the situation and bringing forth restoration.
That that's a really good point. Um, Something that we've been this book we studied at my church recently, and something I've really have been encouraging uh, just all sorts of people in my life to do. We were reading this book called reading the Bible, or
Hmm.
sorry, praying the Bible,
Praying the
and
Bible. Okay.
and it is what it is. It's talking about praying through Scripture and specifically the Psalms, and what made me think of that when you were saying that there is the Psalms are filled with lamentations. I mean, there are th- sometimes we forget about it, but some of these were written when the Israelites were in exile. I mean, it was bad. And we often think as Christians kind of the how great God is and we have the salvation, and yes, we should. We should absolutely have that joy, no doubt. But at the same time, there are some rough things that happen. And when you're talking about your complex trauma, you didn't ask for any of those. They happened though, and I think that's something that we can do as a as Christians and also as clinicians to really point to where, okay, those complex traumas, those issues I've dealt with, I can't run away from them. I can acknowledge them. And as a Christian, I can acknowledge them to Christ. And that is not a sign of weakness. That's actually what we're called to do. Um, so since kind of going back into the rehab period, um, what would you say your process like that is as far as recognizing these issues and actually acknowledging them to Christ? What was that process like for you?
I think that, and I wrote some of this in the book. One of the stories that I talk about in the book is when I was 4 years old. My dad had forced me to eat carrots at the dinner table. I ended up vomiting, and he got very angry and picked me up and threw me in the garbage. And so, I talk about in the book. Fast forward from 4 years old to late 20s. My wife and I are at a wedding, and there's steak and there's potatoes and there's carrots, and I didn't even, Johnny, I didn't even think anything of it. And so I take my fork and I stab it into the carrot and I bring it up and
Mhm.
I take a bite and immediately I start to gag. So it has been things like that I've noticed triggers things from the past, or not the past, when they come up in the present.
Yeah.
Unresolved things. Another thing I don't talk about in the book, but I found this really interesting, is that when my dad would come home, I would get very anxious as a child, but I would know that he got home because that he was coming home because the garage door was going up. So now you fast forward to being married for quite a few years, and we move into our one house, and it has garage doors with electric garage doors. And so when my wife comes home from work, from school, where she works, the garage door goes up, and my heart begins to pound, and I feel this sense of dread. So I wanted to write about my process of being able to backtrack in so many areas and pick up on triggers that I found in my body, that I would feel panicked in my body and I wouldn't know why. But then as I would backtrack, or I would have a counselor help me or just reassure me that there's something there going on, I've been able to put quite a few of those together.
It's so interesting. I think in especially in today's culture, where terms like trigger warning, things like that, they're thrown around so much in popular culture that I think that's one of the problems with that is it really loses some of its meaning when
Hmm.
it's just spread so much. But that is exactly what that is. You weren't. You're eating that dinner, you're not, "Oh, man, let's think about childhood trauma." Like, that was not at the top of your mind at all, but it's immediate, it's just right there. Um, I've had a similar experience, it's not a traumatic one, but just a "Where did that come from?" type of moment where I was in Walmart, this has been several years ago, and my grandma had died at that point, maybe a year or 2 prior, and it was sad, but I wasn't, like, still really distraught or anything like that. So it wasn't on the top of my mind. And I'm just walking through Walmart and this older lady walks by and bam, she had the same perfume that my grandma had. And
Yeah,
there we go. That now I'm thinking about grandma. There's those emotions.
absolutely.
So it's just that same thing, but when it comes to trauma, it can be that much more intensive. Um, I did want just something that you've been talking about. I realized understand what this is, but maybe just to go a little bit more detail with the audience. When you say complex trauma, would you mind kind of going a little bit more in depth of what complex trauma means?
Not at all. So when we look at trauma or when we look at PTSD, we're looking at an individual who has suffered an incident in their life that has caused trauma and has caused traumatic symptoms in their life. When we look on the other hand at complex trauma, we're looking at a series of events that have happened in chapters 4, 5, and 6 of the book, where it's one incident after the next incident after the next, kind of like I say this to clients when I'm working with clients, it's kind of like picture with PTSD that there's one pancake on the plate and it's severe that, like, I'm not negating the effect of that, but with complex, it's multiple pancakes stacked up over a period of time. So it's where it's one event after another, and in my childhood, and I talk about this a little bit, I didn't really get a chance to catch my breath until I was in rehab at 55 years old.
Yeah. No, I really like that example, um, because yeah, you have one specific event, um, bad car wreck or caught in a tornado or whatever it may be. Again, issue, no doubt. Like you said, we don't want to negate that, but it's pretty easy to conceptualize. This is the problem. This is what I need to work through.
Hmm. Yeah.
For you, I mean, now we're talking about carrots and stuff. Like it's you can't just sit there and have, "Oh, this is all I gotta do, and I'll get over it." Um, and that's the kinda line of thinking that I know we went kind of the other way for a little bit of, just being stuck in trauma, which we don't want that either. We want that hope on the other side. But could you speak a little bit more on the other side? And I see this some, particularly in some Christian circles. Well, that was your childhood. Like, you're an adult now. Let's move on. Let's move past that. Don't let the past be the past.
Hmm.
What would you say in a situation like that? Why is that flawed thinking to think like that?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things that right away come to my mind, Johnny. One thing is that the past is never the past when it's coming up in the present. So if I'm sitting there and I'm looking at carrots and I'm getting ready to eat a carrot and I'm gagging, obviously the past is affecting it. I think that a lot of times we don't like to deal with pain. And so we would rather, give a verse or something like that and say, move along. Aren't you trusting God fully? And it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that God has created us with bodies with just incredible brains that are impacted when things go wrong, when there are traumatic things, whether it be physical abuse or whether it be sexual abuse, whether it be verbal or emotional abuse. And it is really important for us to go back in time to look at how that impacted that person. I think when you ask that, one of the scriptures that came to my mind in Genesis, where Abraham and Sarah had kicked Hagar out into the wilderness.
Mhm,
And so she's out in the wilderness, and the angel of the Lord comes to her and asks this just incredible question: where have you come from, and where are you going?
mhm,
And the idea is a lot of times we can't really navigate going forward unless we look at where we've come from and how that's impacted us. And I definitely, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, is because I fell greatly, and it was because so much because of the things that I wasn't aware of in my life that was impacting me.
mhm. That's a I really like the scripture that you use there and kind of using that as some of the wisdom there that yeah, we don't want to be stuck in the past because the past has happened, but you're right. That's something that as Christians we need to know that it's not just oh emotions are you're weak to show emotions or whatever. Like who created those emotions? Who
Absolutely.
created this sense that in your case, you definitely see some of those attachment type of issues that God made us in a way to be dependent on our parents. And I can look at my kids and I know that I make mistakes. I know that. But I also know that after I make a mistake or whatever, my kid's upset, that then they come up and hug me later because we have that attachment.
Yeah.
And when you're not getting that from your caregivers, that doesn't just affect you because that child that grows into an adult is weak. It's because sin was involved. Some maybe from the individual, but more so just in that environment. We live in a sinful world, so to just expect to get over it, that's not the way that God made us in that way.
Mhm.
So with that, um, somebody that is either maybe not necessarily has complex trauma, but is just dealing with hardship in their life. They're a Christian. They believe in Christ. What do they do? Do they just sit there and think about the past all the time? Like what can they do to help work
I
through that?
think that's such a great question, Johnny. I think the idea, and I talk about this also in the book, those one another's, to be able to go to others and to talk to others, especially people that have gone through the same types of situations and have overcome in those areas. Also, you and I would, advocate for our profession, to go seek counseling or go into some therapy, get some help. There's nothing wrong with, leaning on others to get help and to get wisdom and to get insight.
I think that's another key point too. That especially as Christians, we need to recognize that we're not this lone island, and
Absolutely.
that is not just um, a cultural thing or whatever, but it's the way that we're made. And if you think about the church, if it was truly just me and God, I know some people have kind of used that terminology. I don't need church. I just got my own religion. Basically, it's just me and God. Uh, there's pretty clear mandates that we're supposed to be around other believers, to have that community. And if you think of Jesus himself, you think he really needed those disciples? No, he didn't need them, but he had them anyways. So it is kind of arrogant of us if we look at it that if I need help and like no, I don't need any help. I'm good. Um,
Mhm.
that's not the way we were created.
Yeah,
And
I think of the verse, bear one another's burdens and fulfill
mhm,
the law of Christ. Or, another one just came to my mind is confess your sins to one another that you may be healed.
yes, yes.
So important.
I wrote a recent blog article talking about just kind of generic depression and Christianity. And I know that oftentimes we get stuck on just talking about confessing sins. Okay, what did I do wrong here? And now, granted, in that post, I mentioned if you have legitimate sin that you have not confessed, then we need to do that. Confess it to
Mhm.
Christ,
Yeah.
confess it to your wife, to your peers, whatever. But if it's not a individual sin component, I am not following something that I should be. Sin is still impacting what's going on. It just may not necessarily be your individual sin. It's just, again, we live in a sinful world. Your
Yeah.
childhood
Yeah.
was was the fruit of sin,
Hmm.
not not just you. In
Right.
fact, most of this was not you, but sin is definitely there. So ho I guess with us, that just kinda thought of this too. We can really communicate this in a biblical language, because I think it just really fits so nicely. What about people that don't have faith? Um, I think we would both agree that ultimately that full hope is can't really be there without Christ. But how could you communicate this type of growth from complex trauma to somebody that doesn't share our faith?
Well, we were talking a little bit about some of the symptoms, and I put down some of the symptoms. I thought we could go over those a little bit, and just if people would first even become aware that some of these things are signs, together. of trauma or complex trauma, and then to be able to go seek help. Things like mood dysregulation, issues with depression, sadness, anxiety, or anger, where they just have a hard time regulating their mood throughout the day. Nightmares or sleep interruption is very common with trauma, people who've been traumatized. As a result of that, fatigue and tiredness. A big one, Johnny, as you know, is feelings of shame or guilt, worthlessness, just not being worth or good enough.
Mm.
Relationship issues, codependency, a sense of emptiness or loneliness, just like a chronic feeling of loneliness. Physical symptoms like chronic pain, headaches is a big one for people who've been traumatized. Difficulty in trusting others, fearful of others, understandably, because of being hurt so much. Hypervigilance, always being on the outlook or lookout for danger. Unwanted behaviors, things that you can't understand, things that you do that you just don't understand, you don't want to be doing, but you're still doing them. Um, Lack of memories of the past is a big one. Holes in your memory. And I have had a lot of those and I still have those, but not as many after going through this process. And addiction's a big one. Big one is addictions. Whether we're talking about process addictions, like things like gambling or shopping, pornography or masturbation, things like that, or whether you're talking about substance addictions where it's either with me prescription medications and sometimes alcohol. Sometimes food can be an addiction for people. So just even going over that list and kind of saying like, where do I stand with those things? Because if you have a few of those on the list, it might be worth going and looking into to getting help.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great place to start.
Hmm.
Everybody's traumatic experience, if they have one, is going to be different.
Hmm.
We all experience different symptoms. We might go through the same situation and have different
That's a great point.
outcomes, um, but we need to pay attention. Um, that's something that it's that every book I read now since I've become a dad, I read through a different lens because
Mm.
I look at my children in it. And when I'm reading your story and just seeing the personality changes, uh, all the clear signs, like for me on
Hmm.
the outside looking in, I'm like, goodness, yeah, it's clear as day. He's going through this, um, and I'm thinking of my role as a parent. I want to do the best I can to try to prevent any type of abuse or trauma happening to my kids, but I also recognize I can't fully prevent that. I can certainly put them in a safer situation, but life happens and I can't fully predict against that. What I can do is help prepare them. And for me, being an observer, that I know, like my daughter is super fun loving, smiling, making jokes, singing. If she was to come in the next day, um, she went out with friends or something, and the next day, and she's solemn and doesn't sing at all. She's super serious. She's crying all the time. I like to think, anyways, that I would be able to pick up on that
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I see her. So that's something too, and maybe you can speak a little bit more into this as family members that maybe they're not going through anything, but they're concerned about their kids or their spouse or whoever. Can you speak more into to how loved ones can be able to help those that have either experienced trauma or might in the future?
Yeah, and I think you said it beautifully. That idea of awareness. Knowing family members, knowing their temperaments. Watching for any changes that come about for no clear reason. And I think that in this world, there's different levels of trauma, but we all go through trauma. We live in a sinful world, so we're talking about little t traumas compared to big T traumas. And,
Sure.
and I think that both of those are really important. And just to be aware of family members is really, really important. And to be aware of what's going on in your body,
Yeah,
how
and
you're being triggered.
there's differing layers there. I recently spoke at my chamber of commerce last week, and that morning before I went up there, little nervous, but I didn't sit there and think, "Oh my gosh, what all is I'm being triggered. What's all going on?"
Yeah,
I'm nervous because 'cause I'm speaking in front of 100 people. Like, that's to be expected. But that's fundamentally different than I'm in a situation that normally doesn't make me nervous. I'm eating carrots, I love that example. There's there's no reason for me to feel this way. Why? Why? What's going on here? Awareness. So not just with other people, but it sounds like what you're saying too of yourself, your own body, your own cues. You can't just afford to act like nothing's going on when something really is going on.
exactly. And you and I were talking about the idea too of, all of these symptoms or all of these things that manifest themselves, and then how to counterbalance that.
Hmm.
And so I thought we could talk a little bit about that. You
Yeah.
know, again, put through together a list of things. Some of these things that I do on a daily basis, and I always tell clients when I'm dealing with clients, I want you to build a toolbox of self care and techniques that work for you. They might not work for me, but that doesn't matter. If they work for you, that's the important thing. Things like walking or exercise, especially for people who've been traumatized, are really, really important. Talking with a friend, connecting with others, doing breath work can be really helpful in calming the body down when someone's been traumatized. Mindfulness exercises. I do a lot of coloring in the morning just to calm myself down. Drawing is really important. Another one is journaling. Journaling your thoughts and feelings. And, if you want to share them with somebody that's safe.
Yeah.
That's the key, finding somebody that's safe that will be able to hear and not criticize, what you're thinking and what you're feeling. Playing with putty, worry stones. I have a client, I got permission to share this one. Since she was a little girl, she would just roll with her. She had a lot of trauma in her childhood. She would just roll her fingers first with a pillowcase to calm her body down. And then she came up with the idea of using a string or a cord to do that. And to this day, she still does it. But it helps her to regulate the anxiety that she's feeling or experiencing. Playing with animals, a big one. Listening to music or singing. I have a client that, whenever he's feeling really dysregulated, he'll say, you know what really helps me is singing. So he'll spend some time singing. Hobbies, praying, and of course, praying and interacting with the Word of God. So important. Meditating, going outside, spending some time outside. We mentioned already, like counseling or therapy would be really, really helpful for somebody who has had trauma. Doing body scans and just noticing, and we alluded to that, just noticing in your body where the uncomfortable feelings are. Not trying to get rid of it, just noticing where it is. Really, really helpful. Reading, if the person can read and concentrate, and just building a lot of self care.
Yeah. And I love that language. I think I use this on occasion too with some of my clients of that toolbox analogy.
Absolutely.
Because that's what it is. That these are tools. I it's funny with you saying that too. I tell my clients all the time that hey, journaling can be a fantastic outlet, really can. And I always add the caveat and say, while I everything I just said, I agree with, I stand behind, but I'll let you know I actually personally don't have a journal. The way that I really help process through things is I'm always been a pretty good internal processor, so I'm just always thinking. So if I go and take a walk and I'm thinking through those things throughout the day, that's kind of my version of a journal. It's functioning the same way, but I'm not writing it out. But my wife, she does so much better if she has that pen to paper. It's she's not as much of an internal processor like that, so that really helps her get that out. And that's the beauty of this is you find what works for you. I know you communicated it in that way, and then just do it. And I I like to constantly talk about too, and I'm curious of your thoughts on this. Of I'll say some of these concepts, when it comes to either trauma work or just in general, they're really not that complicated. Like, it's not that difficult to understand, but that's fundamentally different than it being easy. Just because something isn't all that super complicated and you need a PhD to be able to figure it out, doesn't mean that it's easy to do. So why do you think that is? Something such as just going for a walk. There's nothing hard about that. Why can that be so difficult for somebody that has dealt with trauma to do a seemingly
That's
simple task like that?
that's such a great question. I think, a verse comes to my mind, and it's in Romans. Paul writes it in chapter 2 and verse 4. It is the kindness of God that leads to change. And I think that for people who have been traumatized, they have not experienced a lot of kindness, and they're not really good at being kind to themselves or compassionate to themselves. Sometimes people say to me, "Oh, no, no, I can't do that. That's selfish." Or, I need to put other people before myself. But you know what? Sometimes you need to put yourself, with self care, you need to put yourself first so that you can take care of others and do a really good job with that.
Uh, I just recently had another blog. It was actually based off a last word segment on a previous podcast, but it was talking about humility, and it was really taking the same type of concept. Um, I never can remember. I need to look it up of where this quote came from, but it's talking about humility being that you're thinking of yourself less, not thinking less of yourself,
Of yourself, yeah.
and that's such a huge difference you have to know
Hmm.
because if it's all about me in every single little situation, then okay, that there probably is some selfishness that's coming in there. But beating yourself up, saying how terrible you are, that's not being humble. That you're just talking bad about yourself, but yourself is still there. So the reverse comes true when you actually do healthy things. You're exercising, you're eating right, you're praying, you're going to church. Doesn't mean your life is perfect, but things are probably going to go better. And
Better.
guess what? When things are going better, you're not thinking of yourself as much. You're able to think about other people. So
Exactly.
yeah, that is a huge point. That again, this isn't just Christians that think that or struggle with that, but I think Christians, especially because we have some of that language of putting others above us, of putting Christ above us. And there's great, beautiful wisdom in that. But we need to be careful about functionally of what we're really doing with that. Because if it's just beating myself up, yeah, that's really not working out in our favor by doing it that way. Uh, What are some other things? I know we've talked about a lot of just fundamentally great things in your story, and I certainly don't want to give every little detail out because we want people to read this, and in fact, it just comes out better when you're able to read it, anyways. But what other things do you think listeners might really think would be impactful from either just your story as a whole or specifically from the book?
Johnny, I think I wrote the book so that I could demonstrate and show a picture of somebody who really fell greatly, who made a mess of their lives, but by the grace of God got back up. And I now have the privilege of being able to share with others what I've learned. You had alluded to the fact, and we talked about it before we were on. It's not an easy book to read. Because there is a lot of abuse. There's sexual abuse, and there's physical abuse, and there's emotional abuse, and there's verbal abuse. Um, but I just think that so many people encouraged me to write the book because my childhood was so strange in so many ways. From armed robberies and sexual abuse and digging holes in the wall to with for my dad. I'll say this: my dad gave us forks and knives and spoons and had us dig out a room downstairs so that he could hide valuables and money and things like that. So I think that I wanted to write it because like I said, I thought it was unique. book about trauma. And I tried the other thing I wanted to be is really vulnerable in it,
Mm.
and to put away my therapist hat until the end at least,
Yeah.
and really just talk about this guy that really got beat up in a lot of ways and was having panic attacks in rehab, and felt like crawling out of his skin, and you know had some really neat people come alongside me and really help me to learn my story and help me to be able to tolerate that story in my body. I can remember getting out of rehab, and some days just being like really like shaking. My body would shake as I would think about the things that happened. And now I can talk about them with relative ease. That's the story. I think somebody who is really fortunate to have really uh, had a God walk with him through, the valley, and to come out the other side. And I also, as I progress in the book, I didn't want to be like, okay, I went through rehab, I processed this trauma, and everything's good now.
Mm.
I have days filled with depression, I have days filled with anxiety, I have flashbacks. They've lessened, but I have flashbacks. So I just wanted to make it something that was like this guy's journey, and it's been a really good journey. I have a great marriage. My wife Debbie is just phenomenal. I have my daughter Emily and her husband Brandon. Emily and Brandon, they just can't tell you how supportive they've been in my journey. And so that has been, and also so many good friends that I've had that have been key in helping me. So it really takes a lot of people to,
Yeah.
to have safe people, though, people that can hear how much you're struggling and sit with you.
I'll tell you, as you're kind of going through just the people that are obviously so important to you. I'll admit when I read books, I'm usually not great at either reading some of the forewords or this book is in honor of blah blah blah. Um, I'll tell you, I did for years though, and I'm so glad that I did. That almost enhanced the story that much more because when I'm reading it I I intellectually understand that you're a real person and this is your story, but I'm reading it more like a novel. Like it's this is the character and the story. It's kind of the hero of the story that goes through all sorts of issues throughout the time. And reading those acknowledgments that took me back into is like, "Oh, yeah, like, those other characters he was talking about in there, they weren't made up, that's not fictional, those are real people." So
Yes, yes,
you could just sense the importance of these people in your life throughout just those acknowledgments that I know you had that thing with the doctor in your rehab, which clearly
yeah,
was a monumental person in your life. So I
yeah.
think
And
you
I'm
could just
still,
really tell that importance throughout
you
your
know,
writing in the book too.
yeah. And Johnny, I'm still in touch with him today.
Can you are we can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Sorry, it was something weird happened there.
Okay.
Okay. I think we're good though.
Okay. But what I was saying is, I'm still in touch with that doctor today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Great. Um yeah, I think you just kind of cut out there for a little bit cuz I didn't hear that part. But yeah, I think that that was very well clearly communicated in the book, which I just think is so neat, to see that passion, of how important these people are, and that's what I wanted to communicate too, as we discussed here and everything that, I mentioned that, fictional type of, book in my mind when I'm reading it and, talked about you being the hero. Um, Certainly don't wanna communicate that, that you're like, "Oh, I'm perfect. I made it to the other side, no arrows." Uh,
I limp daily.
a and I do think you did a good job of actually saying who the hero was, so that,
Yeah,
"Hey, I wouldn't be able to make this without my faith in Christ." I think you did a
absolutely.
really good job of communicating that.
Thank you. That I hope so, because that's the message.
Yes. Okay. One other quick thing, and this is really more so for my benefit. I didn't have this planned. I was just curious as a clinician. Um, I know when I was trained that it was kind of one of those like nobody told me absolutely couldn't ever do any self disclosure, but it was like, hey, be careful. We don't want to make the session about you. Have you found yourself being able to self disclose some of this story with some of your clients, or do you feel like you really need to separate those two things?
No, I think that the majority of my clients have read the book. So it's not like we spend the sessions talking about it, but they will comment about certain things. And certainly I will try to apply that to their life, or I can say to them, you know what, something that I found really helpful in learning my story is, to
Mhm.
write down every trauma, like I talk about in the book, having to write down every trauma and then go over it with, in that case, Harry Flanagan from Pure Desire. But, I think that, the days of not disclosing anything are kind of fading. I
Mhm.
think people want real people that they know have worked through things. And so one of the concerns that I had, and it is a great question, John, is, you know, uh, once I put this book out, what am I going to do? Because people are going to run, and I won't have anybody to see. My business has really grown tremendously as a result of being more transparent, being more vulnerable, and
Yeah.
and being more real. Like, yep, this is what I struggle with.
I I'm so glad we got into this. Really didn't have this planned, but
Hmm.
that I think you're right as far as that self-disclosure. And for people that maybe don't have an idea of what we're talking about in the counseling relationship, there is a degree. I don't think that those warnings came from absolutely nowhere.
Hmm.
That somebody comes in and they say, "Well, my dog died." "Oh my gosh, my dog died last year, and I
Hmm.
can't believe how hard that was." And I just go on and on and on about myself. And the
Right.
client's like, "But my dog just died. I want to talk about me." Um,
Exactly.
so
Yeah.
so that's where that's coming from. But to your point, people want to know that you're a person. You're not. I was really trained to on you're this blank canvas. Essentially,
I was too. Yeah, I
you're
was
just
too
there.
originally. Yeah.
And I I don't think that that is not gonna say that it doesn't work at all, but you don't get the same impact, as when you show a little bit of vulnerability, and it's you have to have a skill with it. You have to know what benefit is this gonna bring my client.
Exactly.
I use my kids all the time in session, and I do it it's actually a really fun way because I will be able to disarm them. Like, they might say, I don't know, that, this person's not doing anything for me in my life, so,
Mm-hmm.
should I just completely get them out of my life? And
Yeah.
I might use and to kinda diffuse the situation, well, my son doesn't do that much for me, should I just get rid of him? And, uh, just to use that, and we'll use my son as just that's our logic battleground there. That's obviously an extreme example, and they would understand that, but then we can take it back into them. But they see a human side to me.
Yeah.
It obviously I care about my son, and then we can take it back to their
To
issue. So
them.
I love that. I love that you're able to use your story and show that we're we're not blank slates. We're not robots. Especially with the rise of kind of AI stuff, Chat
Yes.
GPT,
Yeah.
you know, you can get that if that's what you really want, but I don't think that's what we're necessarily called to do. We're
No.
humans.
Mm.
And that's something too in my own practice, that I've actually seen with some pretty good feedback from people that like, wow, like you're open about your beliefs. I
Yeah.
have my statement of faith that is on my
Mm.
website, and
Hmm.
I make sure put it in bold there. You do not have to agree with the statement of faith.
Exactly. Yeah.
This is here. This is where I'm
Mm.
coming from. Even on my informed consent, I have that same statement of faith and have
Hmm.
do you agree with this? If not, what do you disagree with? And
Hmm.
if you do disagree with it, are you okay being with me? Because
Yeah.
if you are, great, let's keep going. But if not, okay, we can find you someone else. And that level of vulnerability, um, again, it's not just about me and my beliefs, but somebody that's looking for more of a Christian type of therapist, that helps them feel more comfortable in that situation. So I love the fact that you're doing that, in a you have years of experience of how to do it appropriately. I think your clients probably benefit from that vulnerability quite a bit.
Yeah, I think people are willing. What I've seen is people are willing to talk a lot more, even about their addictive behaviors or addictions, because they don't feel the shame.
Yeah. And yeah, if I feel like it's just this person that's giving me all these red marks, "Oh, you did this wrong, this wrong, this wrong." I've got it all figured out. That yeah, that doesn't come across very well. Um, kind of on this shame topic, there's a difference between, we talked about sin of, "I did something wrong, I need to apologize." In that case, that guilt in that situation is actually a good thing, that it points me that, "Hey, I was wrong. I need to right this wrong, or I need to apologize."
Hmm.
So, we don't wanna demonize any and all kind of those negative emotions, whatever we wanna call it, but what is the danger of shame in particular if it just goes unchecked in somebody?
Well, yeah, and let me just back up for a minute. I think guilt, is much different than shame. When we look at guilt, you go into a store and you steal candy and you come out and you feel badly about it. That's a healthy feeling. You have violated a store, you violated the owner, you violated others. So that's a really healthy thing. Shame, on the other side, is this feeling that you're less than, that there's something wrong with you, and that people won't want anything to do with you. And interestingly, Johnny, in the literature points to the fact that when people feel a lot of shame, they go back to their addictions
Mm,
because they want to self medicate.
yeah. Well, if I'm less than, I'm really not that important or anything, then why shouldn't I? Why shouldn't
Right,
I just go back
right,
to it?
right, right.
Not
And I
worth
feel
it
so
anyways.
terrible. I need to numb that pain.
A and that's another excellent opportunity too on a Christian side of things of you don't have worth because of all the great things you've done, because of, all your accomplishments. You're made in God's image. So that that has worth, and we believe that too, not just as Christians, anybody. Anybody that the Satanist that hates God, they still have worth because they're human.
Yeah,
And
they're image bearers.
yes,
From Genesis chapter 1, they have been created in the image of God.
yes. So we need to be able to keep that side of things in mind, whether we're dealing with some of those shameful feelings, or if somebody is acting wrong and they are legitimately wrong. We just need to be careful that we're not putting ourselves way back above, and that
Absolutely.
we're way better. Because again, we're all made in His image, and we need to keep that reminder for sure. Okay. Well, any other things that you want to throw the audience way before we wrap this up?
No, I would just say that if I haven't said it already, I'm a big proponent of getting to learn your story. And I think that we all have stories because in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10, it says that we are his masterpiece, or we are his handiwork. And actually, in the Greek, that word is poemi. We get the word poem or poetry from that. So it's as if God is writing our story. He's writing a beautiful poem, and so I just encourage people to get to know their story better. The hard parts of it, as well as the parts that cause a person to feel joy.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fantastic point. So where can they find the book, and is there a way that they can find more information about you?
Yeah, so they can log on to Amazon and just look up Dr. Mark McNear finding my words, A Ruthless Commitment to Healing Gently After Trauma. And they can just go to Google and type in www.markmcnear.com, and there will be my website, and they can get in touch with me and email me from there.
Perfect. And I would encourage everyone to check that out. I'll include some of these links down below in the description as well. But yeah, it really is just from a whether you're a clinician and kind of hearing a story about trauma just in general, or just want to know what a healing process looks like. It really is a great story. It's quite intense, but again, there's hope. And I know you and me as well. We want everyone to know that there is hope. And this
Definitely.
story is just a great example of that. Well, it was absolutely great having you on. I
Thank you,
really
Tony.
enjoyed the book. I don't even think I mentioned this earlier too. Um, I was actually gifted this book. Wanted to thank you for that too.
You're
Of
welcome,
even
Johnny.
giving me this. It was, like I said, a great read. So definitely check it out. I'll include all those links down below. And until the next episode, I hope you guys have a great week.